Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the very tragic story of Joseph Hutchinson and the murder of John and Israel Hutchinson, which took place in the Sedgefield area in 1828. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. It is completely free to subscribe, doesn't cost you any money at all, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. Sadly, the past lives of those involved in this week's story are impossible to find due to the age of the story, with it being in 1828. However, it is known that Joseph Hutchinson was the son of one of the victims, John Hutchinson, and the brother of the other victim, Israel Hutchinson, and Joseph was one of at least 11 children. At the time of the crime, Joseph is said to be around 50 years old, and John Hutchinson was around 78 years old, and Israel was around 55 years old at the time of their deaths. And the family were farmers and lived at Cowley House Farm in Sedgefield. At lunchtime on Monday, November the 10th, 1828, the Hutchinson family sat down for their usual meal. Joseph was always first to leave the table, and this day was no exception. However, unlike days in the past, this time he returned to the room where his family was still eating, armed with a poker, and suddenly he hit his brother Israel on the head with it, knocking him headfirst into the table. He then struck out at his brother-in-law William, but he was able to get away from him and ran out of the house with his wife Rebecca and their young child. As William was leaving, he saw Joseph had gone on to attack his father, and he was now lying on the ground. William went to a nearby farmhouse to raise the alarm, and a man by the name of William Potter set off to the house to see if there was anything he could do. When he arrived at the house, he found Joseph standing outside with a gun in one hand and a hammer in the other. He told him to put down the gun, and Joseph did as he was told. William then rushed past him into the house and bolted the door behind him. Inside, he found Israel slumped at the table already dead, and John on the floor barely alive. For some reason, when Joseph knocked at the door a few moments later, wanting to be let in, William allowed him inside, and he left him there while he went to find a doctor and a policeman. By the time the doctor and the policeman had arrived, John and Israel were both dead, and Joseph was nowhere to be seen. So P.C. Crosslin set out to look for him, and he was later found on the road heading back to the farm, and was arrested and taken to the police station at Sedgefield. The inquest was held the next day before Coroner Frank. However, the location isn't given, but it is quite possible that it would have been held at the farmhouse in Sedgefield, as inquests were sometimes held at the scene of the crime. And there were also no details given as to who had identified the bodies of both John and Israel, but this may have been his daughter Rebecca or her husband William. William Lamb said he was married to John's daughter Rebecca, and he lived and worked at the farmhouse in Sedgefield. He said on the day in question the family were all having their dinner together. He said 2 of John's grandchildren, both boys, had also been there at the time. He said Joseph often left the table before everyone else, so when he did this on the day in question, it did not seem to be anything unusual. He said he'd not been gone for more than around 1 minute before he returned with the poker in his hand. He came up behind Israel and struck him a heavy blow on the back of the head, and he said Israel fell forward onto the table unconscious. He said Joseph then turned to him and attempted to hit him on the head as well. However, he moved a little and the blow did not hit him fully. He said he immediately took hold of his child, and I must say that it was never stated if this was a boy or a girl or how old the child was, and he also took hold of his wife, and he said they ran out of the house as quickly as they could. He added that as he was leaving, he glanced back into the room and saw Joseph strike out again, this time aiming the blow at his father, and he saw him fall to the ground. He said they ran to a nearby farmhouse and told the tenant there, William Potter, what had happened, and he said that he would go to the house to see if he could help. While William said he remained there so that the wound to his head, which was not serious, could be dressed. When asked, William said the family had all been on good terms that day. He had not heard of any arguments at all. In fact, they had all been working in the fields together earlier that morning. And he said that there had been an argument in October on account of Joseph's behaviour at the time, but he said things had been fine after this. And he did not think that Joseph was insane at the time he attacked John and Israel. Elizabeth Reed said she worked at the farmhouse in Sedgefield and had been there for around 12 months. On the day of the crime, she said she had been outside feeding the pigs when she saw Joseph. He had a gun in his hand and he was outside looking for a hammer. She said he spoke to her and told her that it was time for her to go inside and get her dinner. She said he then came back to the farmhouse with her and unlocked the door. He had locked it when he had left, but it had not been locked when she had come outside earlier. She said as soon as she went inside, she saw John lying on the floor bleeding badly. Joseph went over with the hammer and was about to strike him with it when she said she told him not to hit his father, but Joseph told her he was going to finish him. She said he then began to hit him with the hammer. She said she quickly ran from the house, but she did not say where she went to after leaving. And when asked, she also said that she did not think that Joseph was insane at the time of the attack. William Potter said he worked as a labourer for Lord Viscount Barrington near Sedgefield. He said William Lamb came to his home on the afternoon of November the 10th. He had a wound on his temple and he told him that Joseph Hutchinson had caused it. He also told him what Joseph had done at the farmhouse, and he said he left William and his wife at his home and he set off for the farmhouse. He said when he arrived, he found Joseph outside the front door with a gun in one hand and a hammer in the other. He said Joseph pointed the gun at him without speaking, but he said he told him to put the gun down and Joseph did as he asked. He then dashed past him and went inside the house. He said he bolted the door behind him and went into the room where the family would usually have their meal. He found Israel now lying on the floor near to the table, and he was already dead. He then found John lying behind the door. He lifted him up a little, and John made a faint noise. He said he then heard Joseph knocking at the door, and he let him back into the house. He said he told Joseph, "You have done a bad deed to your father." And he said Joseph replied, "He is not my father. Take a spade or a hatchet and cut him in two." William said after this he left the house as Joseph threatened to kill him if he didn't. When he left, he believed that Joseph had gone back into the room and was attacking his father and brother again. He said he went in search of a policeman and a doctor to tell them what had happened, and Precy Crosslin went to the house. However, by this time there was no sign of Joseph and no sign of his brother Israel's horse. It does not appear that William Potter was asked his opinion on Joseph's state of mind at the time he had met him at the house. Dr. Oswald said he had gone to the house on the afternoon of the 10th and found both men lying on the floor. He said they were both already dead when he arrived. No post-mortem was mentioned, but Dr. Oswald said both John and Israel had fractures to their skulls, which he believed was the cause of death. And he added that they both had many other wounds on their bodies, but these he did not believe to have been fatal. It was stated that after William Potter had left the farmhouse, Joseph had changed his clothes and taken Israel's horse and rode into Durham, where he had gone into one of the local public houses for a drink. And a lady who was described only as the landlady of the pub's sister stated that Joseph had asked her for a loan of 1 shilling, as he did not have enough to buy more than one drink, but she had refused, and he had become quite angry and abusive towards her, and then left the pub. Outside, he had got back onto his brother's horse, and someone who was not named had asked him if his brother knew he was using his horse, and Joseph replied, "Oh yes, he knows very well. I have left him at home, where he is using another horse." He had then left Durham and headed back towards the farmhouse. Apart from being angry and abusive at one point, no one said he was acting strangely or that he had showed any signs of what had happened earlier that day at the farmhouse. P.C. Crosslin said he had found Joseph on the road leading back to the farmhouse in Sedgefield. He said 2 men had been passing at the same time, and he had gained their assistance to get Joseph down from his horse, and he then arrested him for the wilful murder of his father and brother. He said Joseph was acting very strangely, and when he took him back to the police station, he said Joseph had told him he was happier than he had been for the past 6 weeks. And he then described the murders as something good, as if he was proud of it, and that it had to be done, and that he had done what was right. He said he did not seem to be at all concerned by the deaths of his father and brother, and had slept well in the cells that night, as if he had no cares in the world. It was also stated that in October Joseph's behaviour had been very bad, although no one stated what he had actually done, and John and Israel had tied his arms and legs together and beaten him to try and make him behave. It was suggested that this may have been the reason why he later attacked both his father and brother as a revenge for what they had done to him. I did not find any details of any evidence given by John's daughter Rebecca at the inquest. There are also no details of anything the coroner said to the jury. However, the coroner rarely spoke of the state of mind of the prisoner, so he would have most likely told the jury to decide if they felt that this was murder or manslaughter and nothing else. The jury retired for only a few minutes before returning a verdict of wilful murder against Joseph Hutchinson, and he was committed for trial. I did not find any details of a funeral for either John or Israel, but it is known that they were both buried at Yarm churchyard. It seems that this was where the family of John, his own mother and father, were buried, and also close to the location where he had been born. I did not find any details of a headstone for either man in the churchyard. The trial took place at Durham in February of 1829. The grand jury prior to the trial had already thrown out the murder verdict, stating that they believed that Joseph had indeed killed his father and brother, but that he had been insane at the time. However, Joseph had still been sent for trial on the charge of murder. And it is quite rare for the accused to be sent for trial if the grand jury rejected the charge. Joseph was said to be attended at the trial by the prison chaplain and one of the prison guards. He was described as looking like a respectable farm labourer, dressed well, and at first showed no signs that anything was wrong with him. However, when asked how he pleaded, he stood for a few moments without saying anything, as if he did not understand the question, and the prison guard had to repeat it to him, and this time he replied, "Yes, I did it, but were they Christians or not?" The judge, who was not named, at this point was about to suggest that a not guilty plea was placed on his behalf, as he did not seem to understand that he needed to say this. And this was eventually done after a small discussion on the subject, and the jury were about to be sworn in, when Joseph, addressing the jury, stated, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I will bring them a speech book, and that will tell them what to do." The judge then halted the proceedings and stated that he felt the not guilty plea should be withdrawn, and that the case should now be tried on whether or not Joseph was of sound mind, rather than whether or not he was guilty of murder. And this was again agreed to, and witnesses were called to speak of his recent state of mind since his arrest. Mr. Frushard, the governor of Durham Prison, said he had visited Joseph every day since he had been in his custody, which had been around 3 months. He said that he believed that Joseph was of unsound mind, behaving in a very delusional manner, and had been this way since he first arrived at the prison. Mr. Milbank, who was the turnkey at Durham Prison, and if anybody's wondering, the turnkey really is exactly how it sounds. It's the person who is responsible for keeping the keys for the prison cells, said he also believed Joseph to be insane, and he said that it was his opinion that he was actually quite deranged. Dr. Heppel, one of the prison doctors, said he had seen Joseph weekly since he first arrived at the prison, and he said it had not taken him long to realise that he was not of sound mind. Dr. Oswald of Sedgefield said he had been called by the Hutchinson family to visit Joseph around 2.5 years ago. His behaviour had been quite bizarre then, and he had told his father that he should send him to a lunatic asylum as he was not safe to be left at home. He said he told his father that no medication would cure his son. However, he also stated that Joseph had never been admitted to any asylum. No further witnesses were called as the judge felt this had been enough, and the judge did not sum up the case to the jury either, as it seems this was not seen as a necessary thing to do. The jury retired for less than a minute before returning the verdict that Joseph was of unsound mind and not fit to take his trial. He was then returned to Durham Prison, with the judge stating that he would be seen again at the next assizes. Joseph was again brought before the judge in August of 1829. Now, I was not able to find any details of this hearing, but it seems he was still seen as being of unsound mind, as after this he was not returned to the prison and was instead sent to Gateshead Lunatic Asylum. Now, I believe this asylum would have been the one at Sheriff's Hill at Sour Milk Hill Lane, as this was still in use at the time, and the other asylum in Gateshead did not open, I believe, until 1830. I did not find any further details of Joseph after 1829, but it is unlikely that he would have ever been released and probably died at the asylum. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Joseph anywhere in the area, but if indeed he did die in the asylum, he would have most likely been buried in an unmarked grave. This was an incredibly tragic story, and one it seems that could have been avoided if Joseph's father had listened to the doctor 2.5 years earlier, when he had told him that Joseph was unwell and that little could be done to help him. However, I can also understand why John did not want to send his son to a lunatic asylum. Having a family member in a lunatic asylum was a stigma that many families would try to avoid if possible. And perhaps John thought he could control Joseph in some way. Maybe this explains why both he and Israel beat him the month before the crime, thinking that this would make him behave better. Sadly, it seems to have made things worse, although there is no real proof that this beating was the reason why Joseph attacked his father and brother a month later, but it surely can't have been seen as something that Joseph would have wanted them to repeat. Sadly, it seems that John paid a heavy price for not wanting to send his son to the asylum or to get him any further medical help, and Israel paid the same tragic price. Joseph clearly did need medical help, and it is just pure luck that he did not kill anyone else that day, as the others in the house at the time were able to get away from him. In this case, I believe the jury were correct to find him insane, as his rambling statements, the evidence of William Potter about him wanting to cut his father in two, and a complete lack of concern about the crime he committed are not really the actions of someone who knows they have done wrong or someone who is sane. But what do you think? Do you think John was wrong not to send Joseph to an asylum after the doctor recommended it? Do you think the murders could have been avoided if he had done so? Do you think the October beating was the cause of Joseph's violent attack a month later, or do you think it is possible that he would have attacked his family anyway? Do you think the jury were right to find him insane, and do you think that it was correct that he did not stand trial a second time at the August hearing and was simply sent to the asylum? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And before I go, I just want to add that I never found any details about the two boys described as John's grandsons at the inquest, or any details of their names or ages. And also none of the witnesses spoke to say where they went when Joseph began to attack his family. But as they were clearly not attacked, we can assume that they also ran out of the house to safety as soon as the attack began. Anyway, I do hope you have found this sad and very tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.